There's a moment when distance doesn't feel like an activity anymore. It feels like a reflex. You don't announce it. You don't plan it. It happens gently, somewhere between a pause and a breath you didn't realize you were holding. At first, you don't trust it. You wonder if you're overreacting, if you're interpreting something tiny and making it into something greater. You tell yourself that pulling back can be avoidance or weakness or a failure to stay open. Those ideas pass through fast, not with terror, but with a faint internal friction. What's strange is that the friction doesn't grow, it fades. You notice this when you don't feel obligated to follow up. When a message sits unanswered longer than usual, nothing inside you hurries to solve it. When a familiar emotional pull just doesn't activate, the absence seems incorrect at first, like a muscle that didn't fire when it was intended to. You wait for discomfort to arrive, for guilt, for the familiar need to re-engage and smooth things over. It doesn't come. Instead, there's a gentle settling, as if something inside you has decided to stop leaning forward. You start to observe your own reactions with curiosity, the way your body stays relaxed in situations that earlier kept you vigilant, the way your thoughts no longer revolve around specific people when you're alone, the way your inner world feels less crowded without effort. This is unnerving because nothing major triggered it. No confrontation, no final straw, no obvious ending, just distance choosing itself. From the outside, it could look like maturity. You're getting more composed, less reactive, and more self-contained. People could notice that you appear calmer today, harder to read, and less emotionally open. You don't correct them, since you're not fully sure what's going on either. What you do know is that, your internal responses are changing before your conscious explanations can keep up. You're no longer preparing emotional responses in advance. You're no longer bracing yourself for interactions that haven't transpired yet. That continual readiness has gone offline. You realize how much mental space that freeze takes up. There's a small adjustment in timing. You answer later not because you're withholding, but because immediacy no longer feels important. You don't feel the same need to stay aligned with other people's emotional rhythms. You let moments slip, let silence exist, let things linger unsolved longer than you used to tolerate. This doesn't feel passive. It feels selective. You begin to understand that what is changing isn't your capacity to care, but your willingness to shoulder more than your part of the emotional weight. You're still alert, still observant, still capable of depth, but you're no longer dispersing that depth automatically. It's as if an internal filter has softly come online. You don't know what prompted it. You only notice its effects. You're less willing to explain yourself when misunderstood, less eager to clarify your intentions, less interested in healing moments that don't feel mutual. This is unfamiliar territory. You've always been the one who detected misalignment first and tried to repair it, who modified tone, pace, and phrases, who accepted responsibility for emotional continuity even when it wasn't explicitly yours. Now, continuity isn't your major concern. Internal coherence is something you experience most vividly when you're alone. Not the relief of escaping people, but the impression of being uninterrupted. Your thoughts complete themselves. Your emotions settle without criticism. You don't feel tugged in numerous directions at once. This unbroken condition starts to feel necessary rather than optional. You realize how often you used to fragment yourself to stay connected. How many little modifications you made without recognizing you were making them. How much energy went into maintaining emotional accessibility. Distance disturbs that pattern. It creates a gap where the corrections can't happen automatically. In that gap, something stabilizes. People who are used to your availability feel it first. They perceive a delay, a difference in tone, and a lack of engagement they can't quite identify. They may press gently at first, then more insistently, trying to re-establish the familiar dynamic. You don't resist. You also don't respond the way you used to. The effort it would take to return to that function now feels unfair, not exhausting, and wrong. You begin to recognize a distinction you hadn't expressed previously. The difference between being linked and being entangled, between caring and compensating, and between closeness and constant adjustment. Distance exposes these distinctions without criticism. At this time, you still question yourself. You worry if you're getting indifferent, If this calm is a symptom of withdrawal rather than clarity, if you're steadily shutting down instead of growing, the uncertainty doesn't frighten you, it intrigues you, because despite the questions, your internal state seems more stable than it has in a long time. Your moods are less reactive. Your thoughts feel structured. Your energy doesn't spike and fall in response to interactions. You're not happier, you're steadier. That steadiness feels earned, not accidental. And yet, you haven't named what's happening. You don't have a framework for it yet. You only have the lived experience of choosing distant and knowing that something essential is moving. You start to recognize how often distance was portrayed as failure in your history, as avoidance, as giving up, as emotional weakness. What you're experiencing doesn't match those tales. It doesn't feel like running away. It feels like standing still while everything else stops pushing at you. There is a time when you realize you are no longer anticipating how people will react to your actions. You're no longer pre-adjusting to avoid disappointment or tension. You're letting reactions happen without intercepting them. This is a silent rebellion against a way of being that once felt vital. You don't announce it. You just cease participating in certain dynamics. From the outside, it appears like distance. From the inside, it feels like something coming back into balance. You can't yet explain what that alignment is, but you can feel that once it's there, forcing yourself back into old routines would feel unnatural. That revelation lingers unresolved. The inversion happens when you stop wondering whether distance is an issue and start recognizing what it protects. What you originally characterized as emotional coldness begins to reveal a different function, not as a withdrawal from sensation, but as a containment of it. You're not feeling less. You're feeling without leaking. This is where the psychological shift becomes obvious. Distance for you isn't about disengaging from others. It's about disengaging from ongoing self-modification. You're no longer molding yourself in real time to match external expectations, emotional climates, or implicit demands. That shaping began long ago, before you had language for it. You learned early how to assess situations, how to recognize when anything was off, and how to change before disruption occurred. That ability became one of your defining features. It also becomes a liability. As an adult, the same sensitivity that formerly kept things stable began to corrode your internal stability. You absorbed more than you released. You adjusted more than you asserted. You maintained harmony at the cost of coherence. Choosing distance interrupts that cycle. The truth that surfaces here isn't reassuring. Your system learned to emphasize exterior harmony over internal alignment. Since that method worked once, it minimized unpredictability. It preserved connection. It kept things bearable. But tactics don't retire themselves. They maintain operating long after conditions alter. Distance is what finally slows that method down. When you choose distance, you're not rejecting others. You're rejecting a role you no longer need to play. A role that required you to stay emotionally transparent at all times. That permeability made you compassionate. It also rendered you subject to imbalance. This is why the transformation feels permanent. Once you experience what it's like to relate from internal reference rather than external feedback, the old manner becomes untenable. You can't unlearn the difference. Your interactions become simpler, not because you're superficial, but because you're no longer over-processing. You respond to what's truly present, not what might be happening beneath the surface. This clarity is easily misconstrued. People who are accustomed to your emotional effort feel the absence quickly. They view it as detachment, disinterest, or loss of depth. They don't comprehend that depth was never gone. It was redirected. Instead of pouring outside indiscriminately, it now circulates inwardly. First, you check in with yourself before engaging. You notice your own state before responding to someone else's. This self-referencing is novel, and it's irreversible. The rarity of this transition rests in its subtlety. Most individuals link emotional growth with increasing expression, openness, and sharing. Your shift travels in the opposite direction. You become quieter, not because you have less to say, but because you no longer need to say everything to stay connected. You become selective, not out of fear, but out of precision. You become tougher to access, not because you're closed, but because you're no longer advertising your inner world to anyone who approaches. This restructuring isn't empowering in the motivational sense. It doesn't make you feel stronger or more confident. It helps you feel exact. Precision doesn't celebrate itself. It simply operates. There's difficulty in realizing how much of your old identity was constructed around reactivity, being the one who observed, understood, adjusted, and forgave. That identity gave connectedness, but it also required constant output. Distance removes the demand for such output. What remains is a quieter version of you that isn't geared around being required. This version can feel odd, even lonely at times, not because it lacks connection, but because it lacks the usual pull of emotional obligation. You're no longer the emotional center of every interaction. You're a participant. That shift transforms how you see relationships entirely. You observe which ones survive without your regular engagement, which ones demand you overextend to remain functional. Distance reveals this without comments. Some relationships drift away, nor dramatically, nor painfully. They simply stop making sense without your effort holding them together. Others adjust. You don't compel either outcome. You observe. This observing position is the clearest evidence of the psychological transformation. You're no longer inside the dynamic trying to manipulate it. You're outside it, watching things unfold. That stance brings clarity, but it also removes illusion. You see people as they are, not as they could be if you only tried harder. That lucidity can't be undone. The unresolved reality at the conclusion of this change is uncomfortable. Choosing distance didn't make you colder. It made you accurate. Accurate about what you can sustain. Accurate about what costs too much. Accurate about which connections demand you disappear in little ways to stay present. You no longer disappear for anyone. And because of that, you chose distance not as a protection, but as a prerequisite for remaining intact. This doesn't resolve nicely. You don't arrive at an ultimate level of tranquility or certainty. You just cease returning to versions of yourself that required regular correction. That decision doesn't declare itself. It lingers in how you reply more slowly, in how you listen without absorbing, in how you stay present without overextending, and in the peaceful certainty that, once space reorganizes you this way, closeness will never appear the same again. Not worse, just truer than it was before. At the Inner Blade, we explore the edges of self-awareness and emotional clarity. Take this moment to honor your own inner boundaries and the power of a gentle distance. Subscribe and join us on this journey inward, where strength is found in stillness, and true connection begins with knowing yourself.